Today likely signaled the end of the Senate as we know it. We watched a historic moment on the Senate floor today as the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees crumbled. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans invoked the so-called nuclear option that had been nicknamed, changing the threshold for Supreme Court nominees from 60 votes down to 51 to advance President Trump's nominee, Neil Gorsuch. These are, of course, uncharted waters, could have far-reaching implications for the future of the Senate and the future of the courts in general. And yet, for such a monumental moment in our history, or at least in the history of the Senate, it all happened without masses of Americans up in arms. That's because the Senate may simply be catching up to the politics of today. We are a polarized nation. The Senate is an institution that was supposed to guard against this tendency, the cooling saucer, if you will. But the growing instinct of both parties is to retreat to their respective bases. And it's helped condition the country, perhaps, against compromise, that we're in a zero-sum game. And guess what? Politically, it's hard to find a reward for any politician these days for crossing the aisle anymore. So the result in some cases was inevitable.
This result was preordained.
I'm sorry, because I love the Senate, and I've spent a good part of my life here, that we've reached this moment.
Today's vote is a cautionary tale about how unbridled partisan escalation can ultimately overwhelm our basic inclination to work together.
We can argue forever about where this slippery slope started, but tomorrow the Supreme Court will be full again when Neil Gorsuch is confirmed as its 9th member. But the Senate has been altered forever, and perhaps how judges are put on the bench up and down the judiciary branch has been changed. There's only one 60-vote threshold left, by the way, the filibuster for legislation. Joining me now is Colorado Senator Michael Bennet, one of only 4 Democrats who opposed the filibustering of Neil Gorsuch. Senator Bennet, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. Great to be with you.
You are, in fact, the only senator to essentially split your vote, meaning you voted for bringing Neil Gorsuch's nomination to the floor, but you have said you will, when the nomination comes up, vote against him. Explain your decision for voting again, for not filibustering him. Is it only because he's from Colorado, or was there more to it?
No, there's much more to it than that. I'm proud that he is from Colorado, but he's a very conservative judge. The reason I voted the way I did on the filibuster is I think it was not the right fight, because we knew we were going to end up, one way or another, we were going to end up with Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, either through the normal process or by the use of the nuclear option. And if he got on with the nuclear option, it would mean that Donald Trump will likely have 1 or 2 more, at least, Supreme Court nominees that he's now going to be able to put on with not a single Democrat able to object, and with the need of only 51 Republicans. And I think that's going to drag the court in an extremely conservative direction.
It was interesting.
And I don't think it was necessary. You know, it's interesting to me, Chuck, to listen to the comments from the floor of people working in a human institution who are decrying the partisanship and then unable to come together to actually solve the problem. There isn't anyone else in America to do it. I know you're having John McCain on later. I can tell you, I'm sure if you ask him, he'll tell you that he was one of the people that wanted to try to see if we could fix it.
Well, isn't the problem that the political basis of both, that their voters in the middle don't reward you for being bipartisan anymore, because those voters, I guess, are no longer courted, and that the political bases are who you respond to these days? Is that a fair observation?
I think that's true. I think that the parties have a difficult time saying no to their base, even when there are institutional equities at stake that in the long run are going to be to the benefit of their party. And sometimes it's very hard for people to break through that, I think. Certainly my office has gotten calls all week, people very disappointed about the position that I've taken, but I'm not sure people understand that when we wake up on Monday morning, the next appointment could be the judge that redecides Roe versus Wade, and it's on a 51-vote margin, and there's no way to stop it at that point.
You know, that was interesting. It seems to me as what you're saying is one of the reasons you're voting against Judge Gorsuch, because you call him a qualified judge who deserves an up or down vote. You say he's a bit too conservative for you, and you seem to be more concerned about his place on the court if more conservatives get added. Why should that be a factor? Why shouldn't it just be about him? At the end of the day, you're dealing with a Republican president. He's going to nominate somebody that's probably more conservative than you want to have him nominated.
That's absolutely true. In this case, that very conservative justice, potential justice, I guess tomorrow he will be, is replacing the seat of a very conservative justice, Justice Scalia, who died. The next one could change, could transform the Supreme Court, and the one after that, if it's another conservative, would transform it even further. My concern, Chuck, is this, that this has been a very strategic a move by Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the Senate, and the result, unhappily, because we weren't able to get a deal because of the partisanship that you're talking about. Because of that, we may have a very conservative court for 2 generations of Americans' lives, and I think that is a terrible outcome.
Well, at the end of the day, this is now about Senate elections, is it not? Is now every Senate election now about judges? And is this, obviously that's more of a motivator on the right than the left, but is that really what Senate elections should be about?
Yeah, I know. Senate elections should be about so much else. There's so many other issues that we confront. And the other piece of this that just drives me nuts, Chuck, is that when you don't need the other party to do something, the pressure on your party to pick the most extreme person or have the most extreme legislation becomes routine. And you know, a lot of the criticism of Judge Gorsuch was about how he was attempting to obscure his conservative credentials. That's not what you're going to see in the future. What you're going to see in the future is people saying, I'm the most conservative judge there is in America, put me on the court. Or people saying, that's the most liberal judge in America, put me on the court. And I don't think that's going to be good for the court. So now what we've done is we've corroded the Senate, we've corroded the judiciary, and I don't think any of that is good for the country, and to your point, a needless distraction when there are plenty of other issues that we need to be focused on to move families ahead in this country and to figure out what our role in the world is supposed to be.
You know, many in the Senate point to you as one of the more moderating, institutionalist types. Do you think you could have done more in hindsight to stop this? Should you have gotten more Democrats on your side, McCain found more Republicans on his side, come up with a new gang of 10 or 12 that might have prevented this, prevented what happened last year, prevented what happened in 2013? Do you regret that vote?
I do, and I've said that on the floor of the Senate. I think that vote became an excuse. Mitch McConnell knew when we took that vote what he was going to use that vote as a pretext to do. We saw that happen today, so I do regret it. And I think we worked very hard over the last several weeks to try to head this off. We weren't successful. We now need to come together, I think, and make sure that we don't lose the legislative filibuster, which is the next step. And people that are saying now that'll never happen, mark my words. We heard this about the Supreme Court. When we changed the rules in 2013 about judges, people said nobody would ever do that to the Supreme Court. Well, this building may still be standing, but the nuclear option's been invoked and on the justices. And the next step could be legislation, and that would be horrible for our country.
How many Democrats that were there in 2013 are like you and now regret going along with Harry Reid's decision?
There are people who do, I think, and I know there are a lot of Democrats and Republicans who deeply regret what happened today. And I think we need to stop treating that by talking about it in the passive voice as though it's happening to us. This is something that the 100 members in this Senate are responsible for, in fact, or indeed, there is no one else that can take responsibility for it.
It was surreal. It was like as if you guys were looking for Roberts rule, the guy Roberts from Robert's Rule of Order to fix all this for you.
Any little green man would have done, I think.
Fair enough. Well, we'll look for those green men later. Senator Bennett, thanks for coming on and sharing your views.